Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the M3 M5 Stuart light tank. Now, this tank has an absolutely impressive record being a light tank, with service in more than 40 countries, more than 24 variants made by the United States alone, amongst the other countries that made their own variants of the tank, more than 22,000 tanks produced, and is still in service to this day. This tank holds a rather impressive service history, allowing it to be one of the few World War II vehicles still in service somewhere in the world. But let's go ahead and look at the development and history of the M3 and M5 Stuart light tank. Now, the Stuart's design is actually based upon that of the M2 light tank. And now this tank was designed in the 1930s, utilizing kind of some of the earlier developments during 1920s tank development. However, it was a very limited tank. When they first built the M2, it kind of went along with light tank doctrine at the time, which was the idea that these tanks were supposed to be quick, nimble. They really weren't supposed to get into heavy combat. So because of that, the early M2 light tank only had machine guns on board. But after the Spanish Civil War, it was basically discovered that a tank armed with only machine guns was basically pointless. So the M2A4 was developed with a 37 millimeter main gun. However, by 1940, it was pretty much realized that there was a need for a better light tank. And so the development began on a replacement for the M2, and that the M2 would basically be a temporary stopgap tank while they developed a better light tank. Now, utilizing the M2's frame for the basis of a new vehicle, we get two developments. One is the M3 Stuart light tank, and the other is the M4 tractor artillery mover. Now, the M3 took what worked with the M2 and improved upon it. Upgraded design for the armor, modified suspension, and a new gun recoil system allowed them to develop what we call the M3 Stuart now. Now, to better support light tank doctrine at the time, which basically made light tanks kind of a quicker response vehicle against enemy armor, they equipped these with AP rounds, high explosive rounds. They even put better, more improved gun turrets on the Stuarts in order to allow them to engage enemy armor better. Now, the first country to deploy the M3 was actually the British, not the Americans, and the British are the ones that actually gave it the name Stuart. And they would be deployed in North Africa first during Operation Crusader, and it was a disaster. Like I said, light tank doctrine at the time had basically said that light tanks were going to help fight in armored combat. However, against the panzers that they were fighting, the M3 had less firepower, but the Panzer III could actually keep up with it in terms of armor and speed. So they really were no match for them. Add to this, the British did not like the 37 millimeter M5 gun. They did not like the internal layout of the tank. They did not like the turret setup. So because of this, the United States kind of went to the drawing board back on the turret and developed what would become eventually known as the M3A1 Stuart. The A1 and later A3 series Stuarts were basically the upgrades that the M3 needed. They had upgraded the turret setup, added vertical gun stabilizers, improved better armor on the A3 model that came after the A1. So we now have a much better Stuart that can handle a little bit more. Now, even with these improvements, the British actually opted not to use the M3, A1, and A3 models in tank-to-tank combat, as they saw them more of a reconnaissance vehicle, and they felt that trying to get them into tank-to-tank combat would only cause more losses. Now, the Soviets actually didn't like the M3 at all. They cared no way for it. They saw it as less than anything to theirs. And the real success for the Stuart is really going to come for its next development, the M5. Now, interestingly enough, the development of the M5 Stuart was not warranted by the need for like a heavier gun or a complete redesign. It's because the M3 Stuart's engine was needed for other wartime purposes. So they had to build a new setup for a new engine. And they went with a twin Cadillac V8 engine inside the M5. Now, because of this newer engine, they had to redesign part of the hull to basically handle it. But this engine was actually quieter, cooler, allowed for more space in there. They could utilize an automatic transmission, which made it easier for crews to operate. and they went ahead and started adding in new equipment for it, so as to basically upgrade the tank. Now, the only big problem with it was that it still utilized the same gun as the M3 Stuart, so it didn't have as much firepower until much later on in the war. And it's here where we see most of the focus of the M5 being utilized more by the Americans than anyone else. The Soviets actually rejected it because they didn't like the M3 and they already had enough of them, so they didn't see a point of getting an M5. The British, while taking them, really didn't utilize them as much. They actually started converting them to armored personnel carriers known as Stuart Kangaroos, and so they really didn't see enough of a use. So instead, the usage went back to the United States, the manufacturer of them. Now, the big battle for the M5 Stuart actually came during the Battle of Anzio in Italy. Now, basically, what had happened is the doctrine for the battle had called for a company of medium tanks to come in and destroy the heavier defenses, followed by an infantry battalion to basically clean up. However, it was pretty much realized that they couldn't get every fortification and every position, and that there would be a need to protect the troops. So the M5 came in and it really showed that its usage as a infantry support vehicle. Add to that, we get the Leary Valley campaign, where the New Zealanders are actually going to utilize the M5, and they show that it's actually better than their recon vehicles, and it's much better than their scout cars. And so it shows that it really has this good advantage. Now, carry this over to the Pacific campaign, and we see that the Stuart tank has an advantage. Earlier, we saw that with the M3 and the A1 models, that against the Japanese light tanks, the Stuart was actually much better at this. It was made almost for this kind of combat when you really look at it, because of its light speed, its ability to climb, traverse terrain much better than its predecessors like the M2, which was there in the Pacific. It was able to get through the jungles much easier. So we see a better tank for jungle warfare. Now, over the course of the war, quite a few variants were made, more than 24, and these included like this, the 75 millimeter howitzer variants, gun motor carriages, chemical mortar carriers, flamethrower variants, the kangaroo one I talked about earlier, which was a transport variant. And as we move on to post World War II, we actually see even crazier developments, such as the Brazilian X1 series, which basically up engines and up guns the M3 Stuart to have a 90 millimeter main gun. Now, even though the original 37 millimeter gun had kind of limited the usage of the Stuart tank, post World War II, it actually has a major series of conflicts it's going to take places in. It'll be part of the Chinese Civil War, the First Kashmir War, Indonesian National Revolution. It'll be major usage in South America between multiple militaries, the wars in Angola, and even the football war. And it'll serve in most militaries, especially in countries like South America, up until the 1980s and 90s, and is still a part of the Paraguayan armed forces to this day, which they have 10 tanks in their service as of 2014, but they're basically a training tank. But there you go, a look at the M3 M5 Stuart light tank, a tank that was pretty much obsolete when it was developed and kind of took a life of its own. While it wasn't very successful in Europe, except for a few small engagements, it was extremely successful in the Pacific campaign during World War II, so much so that the Japanese actually tried to capture large numbers of the tanks. And after World War II, it actually had a much more successful career than it did during World War II. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to talking to you on the next time.